I'm Mike Belcito, co-founder of eFuneral, and I want to talk for a few minutes about the topic of cremations. Specifically, what makes cremation an option that could be better or worse than a burial? And of course, I can't tell you which one is better than the other necessarily, but what I can do is talk about some issues related to cremations that you can consider to decide whether it might be an option that's best suited for your loved one or for you in the future. The first consideration to make before deciding whether you'd want to pursue a cremation or a burial is cost. Now, the reality is there are cost considerations that come into play. In fact, when one moves forward with a burial service, you're going to be incurring costs such as a casket, which alone can be several $1,000s. An outer burial container or vault, which encompasses the casket, which again can be several $1,000s. You're also going to have to purchase a grave plot at a cemetery. So there's all sorts of costs that you would incur with a burial service that you don't incur with a cremation. Of course, when you have a cremation performed, there are some costs associated with a cremation, such as a container that the body would be placed in when actually being cremated. But the cost for services around a cremation, the actual cremation itself, are much less than the casket, the outer burial container, the cemetery plot, even the memorial stone, which I didn't mention before, if that was something that you were interested in. So cost can be a factor. Another factor that you would want to take into consideration is faith. If you're a person of faith and you have a specific religious denomination, it would be a very good idea to do research on what your faith suggests is appropriate. For some religions, being cremated is not an option. It's something that is not supported, whereas with some religious beliefs, cremation is perfectly acceptable. So if you're a person of faith, you may want to check and sort of research whether or not faith should play a factor in ultimately whether you're going to choose a cremation versus a burial service. The other factor to take into consideration is environmental factor. And that's something that is certainly important. Of course, it's up to you and your beliefs as to whether you want that to play a role in making this decision. Some people believe that burial can actually be quite a burden on the environment, considering all the materials that go into a casket, an outer burial container, which typically is made of cement, and also sometimes metal. And so the whole process of a burial taking up a space in the earth, that's something that should be considered. Then again, sometimes the emissions involved with a cremation can also have a negative impact on the environment as well. So again, that's something to research if you feel that that's important to you, but certainly something that you might want to take into consideration. Now, I do want to kind of clarify that a cremation isn't an alternative to a funeral service. It's a part of a funeral service. So we get the question all the time, well, gosh, the funeral homes in your network, they provide funeral services. So does that mean if I want to be cremated or I want my loved one to be cremated, does that mean that the funeral homes in your network can't help? And that's not the case. In fact, almost every funeral home out there offers cremation services. And they do so in one of two ways. Some actually have their own crematory on site, and some pay other businesses to use their crematory. So even if that particular funeral home doesn't have a crematory on site, a cremation service is still an option. So you should know that. Most funeral homes do offer that. Now, it's not 100%, so you do want to check if there's a specific funeral home you want to work with. But know when you're submitting an inquiry on eFuneral, cremation is certainly an option. The other thing to take into consideration is that just because somebody's cremated, that doesn't mean that you can't have a funeral service that seems traditional in nature in almost every sense of the word. What I mean by that is if you're interested in having a funeral service with a viewing, and you want the entire funeral service to be just like any other funeral service for a burial, except at the very end you want to make sure that body is actually cremated instead of buried, that's possible. you can actually work with a funeral home to have a full viewing if that's something that you're interested in. And a funeral home would be happy to work with you on that. Keep in mind that there are costs to that, but that is an option for you. Just because somebody chooses the option of cremation, that doesn't mean that you can't have a viewing. That's not true. You can have a viewing. So something to keep in mind. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the choice is yours. And I think that it's a very personal choice. It should be one that you don't take lightly, because certainly the funeral service, whether it's a burial or a cremation for your loved one, is obviously an important event. And so I hope that the topics that we talked about in this video at least get your mind going about what you might want to consider before making the decision whether to pursue a burial or a cremation in terms of a funeral service. So to find out a little bit more about cremations versus burial or other topics related to end-of-life issues, feel free to check out our resources section. That can be found at eFuneral.com/resources. You can also visit you could view other video resources on our official YouTube page at youtube.com/eFuneralResources.